Hello and welcome to MENSCHlife. I'm David Grossman, and I'm delighted to introduce you to Karen Mock. Karen, welcome. Thanks very much for being here.
Thank you, David.
I'll tell you a little bit about Karen. We're very honored to have her here. She has this incredible resume. Karen has a PhD in applied psychology. She's a teacher and educational psychologist specializing in human rights, hate crime, and diversity issues. She's an authority on multicultural, anti-racist education. She has served as the executive director and CEO of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, served for 12 years as national director of the League for Human Rights of B'nai B'rith, and as executive director of the League's Human Rights Education and Training Center. She's worked at University of Toronto, Ryerson, and York University teaching courses in multiculturalism and race relations, and she's won numerous awards for civil liberties, women's intercultural work, race relations, Women of Peace, Everyday Freedom Awards. And she's also the Liberal candidate for Thornhill in the next federal election. So we're really delighted that you could join us today.
Thank you.
Thank you so
pleased
much,
to
Karen.
be here, David.
Really appreciate it. So, number of things going on that want to talk to you about today. The first one is, I know you're teaching a number of courses now for women about how to get issues that can arise in the workplace and so on. You want to tell us a bit about that?
Yes, the Power of Women Exchange is a new women's network in York Region, and there's a Thornhill chapter, Richmond Hill chapter, serving the GTA, and they asked me to offer a Lunch and Learn series. And so we've called it Human Rights and Diversity in the Workplace, What Every Woman Needs to Know.
Okay.
It's for women and men to attend.
Men are allowed to attend?
Oh, yes, of course.
Okay.
People who are managers, own their own businesses, or are employees in various institutions and organizations. And, you know, the first session that we did, it's a bi-weekly, 4-week course.
Right.
And the first one we did was on multiculturalism. We called it From Multiculturalism to Anti-Racism to Equity.
Okay.
And I gave an overview of the history of multiculturalism in this country, but more, what does it really have to do with the workplace? The future sessions every other week at different ethnic restaurants throughout Thornhill will include workplace harassment and how to recognize forms of bullying in the workplace and what to do about it.
Right.
There'll be an overview of our human rights law, what are employers' obligations, what should every employee know.
Right.
And our last session will be in general on developing some action plans and overcoming the challenges of putting theory and policy into practice, which in many ways, as you can tell from that resume that you read, has been my life's work. How do you actually walk the talk, not just have policies on multiculturalism or diversity in the workplace or race relations, but how do you make sure that we overcome the resistance to actually implement these policies in practice to ensure the kind of society that we all want?
Do we still see a lot of racism, discrimination in the workplace? I mean, I know there's been a lot of effort in our society through, human rights commissions and tribunals and different things. We've come a long way. Do we still see a lot of this happening in the workplace now?
Well, I'm glad you said we've come a long way, because indeed we have.
Right.
And I am very concerned when I hear people speak about how rampant racism is, or how rampant anti-Semitism is, or Islamophobia. Having said that, we still have a long way to go. And yes, indeed, there is evidence of continuing racism, anti-Semitism, heterosexism, as I call
heterosexism.
Sure. Well, homophobia is sometimes called. As I coined the expression several years ago when I was asked to design a course for the Toronto Board of Education on multiculturalism and diversity and equity in education, the subtitle of it was, "Why aren't the isms wasms?"
Right.
After 40 years, I mean, we have had the policy in Canada of multiculturalism for 40 years now.
Right.
In October of 2011 will be the 40th anniversary of Pierre Elliott Trudeau's having declared multiculturalism an official policy of Canada on the floor of the House of Commons. And in addition to that, of course, all of our human rights commissions. But there is actual data, and that's so important to collect it. When I was head of the League for Human Rights of B'nai B'rith, which, as your viewers will know, is the Canadian Anti-Defamation League, part of our raison d'etre was actually to document reported incidents of anti-Semitism and of racism, because too often you hear employers or even government officials say, oh, it's only your perception that there's racism or anti-Semitism or any of the other isms. But it's important to investigate. Not all reported incidents are what they may appear to be. I mean, someone can be evaluated as not doing their job well, and it could indeed be that they're lazy and not doing their job well. But if you notice differential treatment in the workplace, as we have actual evidence that, for example, perhaps it's part of the culture of that workplace that everybody comes in around 9:15 with their coffee, and some will stay late, and it's a flexible work hour. But we will have cases where someone is documented as arriving late, and it turns out they're the only black employee, or they're the only Jewish employee. And that would be a definition of differential treatment. Yes, they were, quotes, breaking the law, but if it was the norm in that workplace and they're the only ones singled out, then that is considered evidence of discrimination. And I'm describing that as the more subtle. There still are, regrettably, overt incidents of racism and other forms of discrimination in the workplace.
Okay, now one of the things we've seen in recent years, Ezra Levant, Canadian who, I forget the name of the newspaper he runs out in Winnipeg, he's an outspoken conservative, and he wrote this book. What's the name of the book again? You know what I'm talking. Shakedown. Okay, so he's arguing that this idea of the human rights commissions and the tribunals have gone too far, and we do see cases in the media of such examples. But I think you would argue that the media is just taking the worst, or the cases that have gone to extremes, but we don't hear about all the other cases where there was benefit. Is that the case? I mean, are there many of these cases that the tribunals and commissions are handling that are really very helpful?
Absolutely. We have a system in Canada whereby people who have been discriminated against have recourse. And you don't hear about the daily kinds of incidents, the kinds of settlements that are happening through mediation, or there may be a mandatory settlement where if a workplace undergoes some kind of training, I'm still actually listed on the list of the tribunal when they make a settlement, and they feel that the management needs to understand the policies a little bit more effectively. Maybe some of their discrimination was even inadvertent. And so we'll go in and we'll do a training session, and usually these cases are bona fide cases of discrimination, number one, and number two, one can create a better environment in the workplace. Regrettably, it's some of the cases that get blown out of proportion in the media. First of all, people have to be able to have the power to commandeer the media, and if they've got a very wide audience, I think sometimes an unsuspecting public can be made to think that we should be removing our human rights commissions or tribunal. I really think that this is misguided thinking. Many of us fought very, very hard over the last many years, particularly those who were victims of anti-Semitism, of racism, in days when people were not able to be hired or there were quotas. The list is this long of the really overt discrimination in housing, in employment, in service delivery. I say thank goodness for our laws and codes in this country. Now, we do have those who say, well, wait a minute, yes, we fought those battles, but now when, dare I say, other communities can now say, wait a minute, what about us? And when you have, let's say, a Maclean's magazine that has all over its front pages, you know, veiled faces and frightening people about, you know, the Muslim peril, or recently in some of the newspapers and magazines, are there too many Asians in our schools? This is fear-mongering, especially when you find out, as we did, by the way, in the days of the W5 incidents with CTV, it's 30 years ago now, when the same kind of specter of Asians overtaking the medical school or what have you were raised. And it turned out that the people that were pictured were Canadian-born students of Asian background. So those who have often enjoyed the benefits of a multicultural society, of equal access, and now have a fair amount of what I would call, and others would as well, power and privilege, that they do have the pen and can reach out to a wide audience, perhaps, in my view, blow some of these incidents out of proportion.
Okay, I want to ask you about multiculturalism. We're going to take a short break in just a moment, but when we come back, I want to ask you about this because recently there was a conference in Europe, a Munich Security Conference, where British Prime Minister David Cameron spoke, and he was talking about this idea of multiculturalism, and apparently Nicolas Sarkozy echoed some of his thoughts. And in Europe, there's it seems that there's a feeling that multiculturalism may not be working anymore. We need to bring people into the melting pot, or at least to better recognize Western democratic values of freedom and such. So we're going to talk about that in just a moment. Be right back with Dr. Karen Mok. Hang in there. We're back here on MENSCHlife with Dr. Karen Mok. So we're talking about this idea of multiculturalism. And in Europe, call it Islamophobia, call it what you want, but there's concerns. I think perhaps not just with the Muslim community, but there are young Muslims who are being radicalized, and there's a concern that they need to be brought into the melting pot, like we have in the U.S. Canada's always had this idea of a mosaic. Can we sustain this mosaic here in Canada?
I believe we can and we must.
Okay.
I think I heard a few concepts get mixed up in the introduction to this topic. Number one, the policy of multiculturalism. There are those who will try to say that it is a very divisive policy, that it kind of keeps people in their ethnic enclaves. It's about songs and dances, or it's about having people celebrate their own cultural background and not be integrated. That is a complete misunderstanding and distortion of our multicultural policy that was then enshrined in law in 1988 as the Multiculturalism Act. When people read that act, they see that it is about integration. It's about helping people from all backgrounds integrate into Canadian society as quickly as possible. And so through the multiculturalism program is when you have your anti-racism initiatives, your citizenship education, in the days when the policy was being well implemented, you had effective funding for English second language, French second language, citizenship classes. How do you help people develop both the lingua franca that they need and also the knowledge they need to become well integrated, not to leave their heritage behind? Because now here's where I kick in now as an educational psychologist. In order to be fully fledged Canadian, people have to have a good sense of self-esteem. You need to have a good positive identity. And we don't have an official religion in this country. But we do have laws that we want all Canadian citizens to abide by. They have to know what those laws are, and at the same time understand that through the Multiculturalism Act, we will work to break down the barriers to equality in society. And so when you have a melting pot philosophy, the way they did in the States, and say they still do, when it's then realized that there's complete differentiation and you had people of color not having equal access to that melting pot or being able to move up the corporate ladder. In this country, Francophones, Aboriginal people, people of color, people of minority religions, you know, be they Jewish, Muslim, you name it, then we say, aha, it's the implementation of that policy that's a problem.
Right.
So what worries me, and this happens every time we have a recession or a recessionary climate, you get those voices coming out that would rather maintain the status quo and don't want to, in fact, have what I would call shared power or equal access by all. They would like to maintain their own power and privilege in the society. And that's when you start to see multiculturalism denigrated as a policy. When you start to introduce the notion of people that are Islamophobic on the one hand, but on the other hand, legitimate identification of people who are terrorists or hate mongers. You can have white supremacists who want to undermine other people's freedoms as well. That's when we have to say, wait a sec. You want to be in this country? You need to abide by our laws.
Right.
It's not our values per se, because when you do any number of cross-cultural research, people have the same values. They want safety and security for themselves. They want sustenance, you know, for their children. They want to belong. They want to be able to have positive self-esteem and equal access to what this country has to offer. That's where we have to put our money where our mouth is and not raise up this specter of those who would rather not have, in fact, human rights for all and, in fact, implement the laws and the values of Canadian society, which, by the way, increasingly people south of the border in the United States have also realized. So their diversity in the workplace programs that are designed, in fact, to embrace diversity are heading in the same direction. We must speak out against terrorism. We must ensure that there's safety and security and adherence to Canadian laws, that there is not violence, but at the same time, we need to make sure that we don't have differential treatment such that people are held in poverty and that there's a correlation with color on that, for example, which then leads to a powder keg of people wanting to rebel. And at the same time, make sure that people aren't raising the specter of a minority group that wants to change our laws or implement Sharia laws. Simply not the case. 95% of Muslims, of everybody in Canadian society want what all other Canadians want. We need to marginalize those who don't want that and ensure that we empower those who came to this country for the same reason, unless you're descended from Aboriginal person. People have always, for centuries, come to this country for exactly the same reason. And that's for a democratic society that treats its citizens, its residents, fairly, equitably, and working together, we will achieve success.
Okay, we've got to take a short break. But here's a question I want you to ponder while we go to our short break, and that is what is happening on campus. It seems that, to me, that the kinds of extremism and anti-Semitism that we see on campus may be unique to Canada. I mean, we know that the Israeli Apartheid Week, which is coming up soon, started here. Does it have anything to do with the way we... Because, I mean, on the one hand, you're saying, you know, yeah, you separate those who have terrorists or anti-democratic values, but is there a slippery slope? I mean, even Tariq Fatah a moderate Muslim, we'll talk more about him soon, talks about the fact that that in the mosques, many of the imams are preaching very negative things on a regular basis. Think about that for a moment. We'll be right back here on MENSCHlife with Dr. Karen Mock-Hagan. Okay, we are back with Dr. Karen Mock. So Karen, the question is, on campus we have this, what seems like could be worse coming from Canada in terms of extremism, anti-Semitism. This Israel Apartheid movement started here in Canada. Does it have anything to do with our immigration laws? What do you think it's all about?
Well, on the one hand, it isn't only Canada. We have all kinds of evidence of this kind of thinking in many campuses in the United States. In fact, my colleagues at the Anti-Defamation League or at the American Jewish Committee years ago put out pamphlets like Bigotry 101 on campus. That was one of the documents that came out of the American Jewish Committee, or Countering Anti-Semitism on Campus. In fact, it was in 1993 that I wrote a document on countering anti-Semitism in Canadian campuses and what to do about it. So this isn't new, and this is not restricted only to Canada. Yes, you're right, the so-called Anti-Apartheid Week started here and spread, and many of us are very concerned about that. I mean, I would be much happier if they did this as a measure to counter Israel Week that was held on campuses. And so if people wanted to hold a pro-Palestinian week or a Palestinian Human Rights Week, then go ahead. We believe in freedom of speech, we believe in academic freedom, and young people on campuses, it will be forever thus, where they are politically aware and want to raise issues and rally round. Calling Israel an apartheid state, or accusing Israel of all of the worst crimes of the 20th century, genocide, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, Holocaust. These are complete misnomers. It's appropriation of language to try to vilify only the Jewish state. Remember I mentioned earlier differential treatment?
Right.
On the basis of a religion or race or gender is evidence of a human rights violation. Well, it has been said that in the same way as Jews have been singled out, if the Jewish state is singled out over all other states, then in fact that is differential treatment, and if it's differential treatment according to the Jewish state, they have become, as has been said, the Jew among the nations. So what I am part of is the work to bring Muslim and Jewish students together, Arab and Jewish students together, the ones who truly want peace, who want dialogue, who want human and civil rights for themselves, and not only themselves, but for the other. You are not a human rights activist if all you can recognize are human rights violations against yourself and not against the other.
Right.
So on campuses, we absolutely must speak out when anti-Zionism, as some people will want to call it, crosses the line into anti-Semitism.
Right.
Having said that, there are people who send around emails in the Jewish community where if you substituted the word Muslim or Arab
Yes.
for Jew in their emails they're sending around or their speeches they're making, they would be appalled. Yes, as Tarek Fatah has pointed out, and rightly so, there are some mosques in which hate is being preached.
Yes.
I am very saddened to say that there are some Jewish sectors where people are spreading Islamophobia. We need to empower on campus, again, that 95% I was referring to earlier. Marginalize the extremists. Speak out against those who are appropriating language and crossing the line from legitimate political discourse into hatred. That's a field where I and others in our Jewish organizations, like the Simon Wiesenthal Center, B'nai B'rith, Canadian Jewish Congress, Anti-Defamation League, American Jewish Committee, have tried to assist police, community, and others to make that distinction.
But they're not all these organizations. In fact, I don't know if very many of them at all are really trying to enhance dialogue between Jewish and Arab or Muslim or whoever students. That doesn't happen an awful lot.
Regrettably, again, present company notwithstanding, hopefully, many in the media will exacerbate the incidents. Maybe yes, we know there have been incidents of violence. Yes, we know there have been protests. But they are not, you know how they say it's boring unless it's violent. What is it? If it bleeds, it leads. Where are those who are reporting on Shalom Salam programs in schools, in universities? Myself and colleagues have been in universities doing programs called Recognizing and Countering Anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, an anti-racist approach to building allies. And it's wonderful when my Muslim or Arab colleague, when a person in the audience who's been primed and gets up and starts, nattering on about human rights violations in Israel or anti-Semitism and, anti-Zionism or Zionism being racism, and to have my Muslim colleague or Arab colleague say, excuse me, I'm not sure you have the correct information. I have learned, says my Muslim colleague, that Zionism is the self-determination movement of the Jewish people.
Yeah.
And then I pipe in, and just as all people, according to human rights law, are entitled to self-determination, Jews, Palestinians, others, and then my colleague says, Karen, you explain it better, because you need to help this gentleman understand what Zionism really is about. Or to have an Arab colleague say, now I understand why it is totally inappropriate to call Israel an apartheid state, when in fact there are Arab members of the Knesset. People are entitled to vote. There's attempts to ensure that there's human rights for all, that Arabs and Muslims can take their cases to the Supreme Court. At the same time as we do need to recognize where there is human rights violation in employment and in other ways in Israel, it is not an apartheid state. Then my Jewish colleagues, when you have deep dialogue, understand that when an Arab who wants to go to visit, from Canada to family in Ramallah, has to have an identity card and may take 2.5 hours to go through various checkpoints, whereas his counterpart in our group from Israel can just go 40 minutes down a superhighway. That if they start to use language that in the West Bank people live an apartheid-like existence, that would be a more effective use of the language and not vilify the state of Israel. So we must empower those people who truly want human rights to prevail here in Canada. There are many cases through the Association of Jews and Muslims, the twinning of mosques and synagogues, for example.
No, those are all great initiatives, Karen.
To fight against anti-Semitism together.
I was just going to say that the use of the word apartheid at all is a little bit inflammatory.
It's very inflammatory.
I mean, even if you say an apartheid-like existence.
Again, dialogue.
Right.
And understanding the narrative and the position of the other.
Very important.
Is
and it's not happening. And it's not happening enough.
It's all about
It's not
compromise.
happening enough. There's a lot of people in both communities who are acting in a way that is divisive. You know, we have people, because we have a lot of immigration here, people coming from Arab countries sometimes don't have Holocaust education where
Correct.
they come from. So there's opportunities
Absolutely.
As well.
You know that I led the Holocaust and Hope Educator Study Tour for many years, and we would bring, and it would include Muslim teachers from time to time, people of color, the idea being that those who want to denigrate the teaching of the Holocaust or not recognize that the true essence of teaching about the Holocaust
Yes.
is not, as some would say, to somehow increase the feeling of victimization of Jews, but rather to educate students and teachers that never again should totalitarian thinking rule the day.
Right. Well, I know that Amir Gisson, who's the Consul General of Israel for Canada, has said that one of the opportunities that we in the Jewish community are really missing out on, many of us, is this opportunity to reach out to others and to learn from each other and to dialogue. So Karen, I want to congratulate you for that, for the work you're doing. And the other thing, because we're almost out of time now, and I hope you don't feel like we just did any sound bites, that you had an opportunity today to fully explain yourself. You have this very interesting event coming up that you're organizing with Ted from your team, Purim and Persia. Want to tell us about that?
That's right. When after Shalom Toronto did a lovely profile of me, Salam Toronto did a profile, and they are a paper that's in Farsi for the Persian Iranian community here in Toronto and in the GTA. And the publisher said, you know, in Iran, our communities used to do events together. And here, our relationships are more one-on-one. And it then occurred to me, wouldn't it be wonderful if we held a joint event? And so March 13th, which is the weekend right before Purim and Nowruz, Nowruz being the New Year, the Persian Iranian New Year, it falls right on the same weekend as Purim. And when you think back, Queen Esther, King Ahasuerus, and so Reza Maridi, who's the MPP in Richmond Hill, and is Iranian, Persian, and myself are co-sponsoring, our organizations are co-sponsoring for the entire community a joint Purim Nowruz celebration, costumes, music, a real Purim in Persia kind of spiel to celebrate how important it is. Maybe in this case, being Queen Esther and wanting to speak out and continue to work for my people, which is what I have always done, and the idea of bringing communities together, not regrettably, you know, when we're in this political climate and the politics of division seems to be practiced far more.
Right.
It is truly Canadian to bring people together, to continue to support our work in multiculturalism, anti-racism, equality, social justice, and celebrating not only our differences, but equality and Canada.
Well, congratulations on the great work you're doing and the courageous work you're doing. And that is actually a great segue to our next segment, because we have Lisa Gardner-Plant from the Canadian Committee for the Haifa Foundation, because Haifa is also a great model of multiculturalism.
Yes, and I actually am past president of Canadian Friends of Haifa University, and our Partners for Peace program is exactly about that, that in Israel, there are so many dialogue programs happening, and people who truly want peace know that it's about bringing people together, compromising, and ensuring that everyone has social justice and democracy.
And good luck on the next federal election.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much,
Okay,
David.
we're going to be back in just a moment with Lisa Gardner-Plant to talk about the Canadian Committee for the Haifa Foundation, some of the work that they're doing, especially with the recent fire in the Carmel region of Israel. They're very busy these days. So hang in there, we'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to MENSCHlife. We have a few minutes remaining. Lisa, I kept you waiting so long. I'm so glad you're here.
Absolutely.
And we do have some time to talk about the Canadian Committee for the Haifa Foundation. This is Lisa Gardner-Plant. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Appreciate
My
it.
pleasure to be here.
So the Haifa Foundation has been very busy lately
Yes,
with
we
the fire in the Carmel region.
Yes.
It's being a big part of what you're trying to deal with now. Do you want to tell us about the foundation and how the fire has impacted your organization and what you're...
Well, we have been in existence since 1995 in Canada. The Haifa Foundation it's located, in Israel. We have a branch in Canada, which is our Canadian committee, in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and in Germany. And our goal is to raise money for any need that happens in Haifa. We raise money for hospitals, for the universities, for individual therapy sessions for special needs children. We help support any need, really basically, that there is in Haifa. In December, unfortunately, there was such a devastating fire. December the 2nd it began and lasted for, as we all know, for a long time and destroyed many acres, thousands of acres of
How
land.
many people died in that?
44 people were
Right.
killed. So right now, so what we did initially was we created an emergency appeal campaign, and we had a fabulous response in Canada. I have to say that the Canadians were amazing, and I got calls from people from Nova Scotia from Nova Scotia to British Columbia, calling and giving support. $20, $36, $5,000. One couple gave $50,000.
Wow.
So the money that we raise is going towards many different aspects of helping with the rehabilitation from the devastation.
Right. So now, what's the story with the trees? You were telling me that they want to wait to see if they
Well,
might...
right now, people are still raising money towards the rehabilitation of the forest, which will happen. But the environmentalists in Israel want to wait, and I thought it was 1 year. They want to wait 2 years until anything is done to the forest land. What has been done so far is the pathways have been fixed, the pathways through the forest. But because of the way nature regenerates itself, when the trees were burning, the extreme heat from the trees made the cones inside the trees explode. And inside the cones are multiple seeds. So the environmentalists want to see in the next 2 years how the land will regenerate itself through nature until they decide what their plan is to assist that the regrowth of the forest.
So there may be automatically some... You were telling me that somebody was there and there's like little flowers blossoming?
Yes, one of our friends went to Haifa in January, and she wanted to witness, the effects of the fire herself. And she said it was amazing that there was all this burnt soil, but when the winter flowers that grow in Haifa at the time, in January, were sprouting through the burnt soil. And she said it was just such, an example of hope and beauty that there's still life
Right.
under all the devastation. So.
Right. And it's still very dry, I imagine, in Haifa.
Well, actually, a couple weeks after the fire, it had been very dry. It had been an exceptionally dry season. It was raining, and then there was actually a little bit of snow that happened.
Okay.
Yeah, which is not very common. But so now the weather is, back to normal. But it was so devastating because of the extreme heat of the summer that lasted really far into the fall, which
Right.
was unusual.
We were talking just before you with Karen Mock about multiculturalism in Canada, and I think that in many ways Haifa is a model as well.
Yes,
would
it
you say?
is. Oh, absolutely, and that's what we try and promote. And when people ask us about what we do in Haifa, we really are a model for the country of Israel. There's so much multiculturalism there. There is an amazing coexistence in that city. I was visiting in May, and we were at a museum, and there were Arab children getting on a bus and Israeli children getting off the bus to come in, and you don't really see that a lot in a lot of the other cities, I was told. And we would go to restaurants, and I would, we would be in Arab-owned restaurants, and everybody obviously speaks Hebrew, and it just seemed very very comfortable, and it is something that people from Haifa are very proud of, because they do coexist very peacefully with the Arabs in that city.
Yeah, and it's a very beautiful. Like, isn't Haifa the capital or the head office for the Baha'i?
Yes, Haifa is the capital city for the Baha'i
temple,
community.
The Baha'i temple.
It's absolutely beautiful. The Baha'i terraces. Baha'is come for pilgrimages to Haifa. It is a city that's very holy to them, and it's very and everybody there respects that as well. So there are Catholics, there are Baha'is, there are Muslims, there are Jews, and it is a jewel of a city. It really is so beautiful. There's a lot, it's the north, so sometimes people don't really spend as much time in Haifa, and a lot of tours bypass Haifa, but really it's, if I were to live in Israel, I really believe that I would live in Haifa. The Mediterranean is so beautiful. The Navy is stationed there. It's the head port, and it's a very high-tech city as well.
Yeah.
A lot of high-tech companies, Google, Microsoft, all the high-tech companies are in there. They actually have a business area with all of these companies, and they promote education. We're becoming a really big university city as well. That is something that we're moving towards as well. So there's a lot happening in Haifa, and our committee does everything anything to support that.
Right. So lovely city, a place that people must see if they haven't. Built on the side of a mountain.
Yes.
Absolutely gorgeous. But unfortunately, we don't have any more time to talk about the Haifa Foundation.
Well, you have to invite me back, David.
We most definitely we will, Lisa. And we had the website up on the screen, but again, it's Haifa-Foundation.
Haifa-Foundation.
.org, I think.
Yes.
And there's actually a scrolling list of some of the things that the organization is trying to raise money for, fire trucks, different things.
Absolutely. And I can be contacted as well in Canada. But if you go on our website, all of our contact information is there.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing all that information with us. And thank you all for watching this week on MENSCHlife. Until next week, don't forget to be a mensch. I'm David Grossman. Thanks for watching.